The Galactic Fauna Preserve on Nexus Station 7 was the most dangerous place in known space, and everyone who worked there knew it well. For within its reinforced walls lived creatures that had killed more sentient beings than most wars in galactic history. The Alpha Beasts were legendary for all the wrong reasons, standing 12 feet tall with armored hides that could stop plasma fire, and eyes that seemed to look straight through anyone who dared meet their gaze. Their psychic abilities had driven trained empaths to complete madness within seconds of contact. For 100 years, the Preserve's governing council had tried everything they could think of to find suitable caretakers for these magnificent and terrifying creatures. And 17 different species had accepted the challenge with confidence and pride, only to end up as nothing more than bloody stains on the enclosure floor. The Virixians had sent their strongest warriors, steel, with their bare hands, and had never known fear in their entire existence. But the Alpha Beasts had torn them apart like they were made of wet paper. The Krellans had offered their most brilliant scientists, hoping that intelligence and careful study would succeed where brute strength had failed. But those scientists had lasted only 3 days before their screams echoed through the station corridors. The Mendari had contributed their most gifted empaths, beings who could calm raging storms with their minds and soothe the most troubled souls in the galaxy. But the psychic pressure from the Alpha Beasts had shattered their sanity like glass hitting stone. So when Director Velith of the Preserve announced that a human had volunteered for the position, the reaction from the galactic community was exactly what anyone would have expected. Laughter filled the council chambers as delegates from 100 different worlds found the idea absolutely hilarious. Humans were soft and fragile, and had only joined the galactic community 50 years ago, and most species still considered them barely more than clever animals who had somehow stumbled into space travel. "A human," sneered Ambassador Drex of the Virixian Empire, his massive frame shaking with amusement. "You might as well send in a child with a stick and hope for the best." Director Velith, a tall insectoid being with compound eyes that reflected the chamber lights like scattered diamonds, simply nodded and said nothing in response to the mockery, because she had learned long ago that arguing with fools was a waste of precious time. The human in question was named Sam Porter, a 34-year-old former wildlife rehabilitation specialist from a place called Montana on Earth, a man who had spent his entire career working with dangerous and unpredictable animals that most people would run screaming from. He was not particularly tall or strong or impressive in any physical way, standing at average height with brown hair that was starting to go gray at the temples and hands that were rough and calloused from years of hard work. When Sam walked into the Preserve's main observation area on his first day, 100 alien diplomats watched through reinforced glass that could withstand a direct hit from a ship-mounted cannon, and every single one of them expected to witness another death. The enclosure was massive, designed to give the Alpha Beasts enough room to move and hunt and live something resembling a natural life, with artificial terrain that included rocky outcroppings and dense vegetation, and a small stream that wound its way through the center. The 3 Alpha Beasts were named Terminus, Nova, and Echo by the previous staff members who had not survived long enough to learn if the creatures had names of their own, and they turned their massive heads towards Sam the moment he stepped through the inner door. The largest of the 3, a male whose armored hide was scarred from countless battles and whose presence seemed to make the very air heavy with threat. Nova was slightly smaller, but no less dangerous, a female whose scales shimmered with an iridescent quality that would have been beautiful if not for the rows of razor-sharp teeth visible when she opened her mouth. Echo was the youngest, still growing into her full size, but already capable of killing anything that moved with terrifying efficiency. Their eyes, each one the size of a dinner plate and filled with an intelligence that was impossible to deny, fixed on Sam with an intensity that made every observer hold their breath and wait for the inevitable screaming to begin. But Sam did something that no other caretaker had ever done in the entire history of the preserve. Something so unexpected that Director Veleth actually leaned forward in her observation chair to make sure her compound eyes were not malfunctioning. He sat down on the floor, crossed his legs, pulled out a worn paperback book from his jacket pocket, and began reading aloud in a calm and steady voice that carried through the enclosure like a gentle stream. He did not look at the alpha beasts or try to establish dominance through eye contact or body language, and he did not show the submissive postures that the Mandari empaths had tried before their minds shattered. He simply existed in their space, asking nothing of them and demanding nothing from them. Just a man sitting on the ground, reading a story about a whale and the captain who hunted it across endless oceans. The diplomats watching through the glass exchanged confused glances as the minutes stretched into hours and nothing happened. No violence, no screaming, no death, just a small human reading a book while three massive predators watched him with expressions that no one could quite read. Some of the observers grew bored and left to attend to other business, convinced that the human you'd be dead by morning and there was no point waiting around for the inevitable. Others stayed out of morbid curiosity, placing bets on how long it would take before the beasts finally attacked and ended this ridiculous experiment once and for all. But Sam just kept reading, occasionally pausing to take a drink of water from a bottle he had brought with him, or to stretch his legs when they started to cramp from sitting in one position for too long. He turned pages with a patience that seemed infinite, his voice never rising or falling with anxiety, never betraying any fear, even though he was surrounded by creatures that could end his life in an instant. Near the end of the 6th hour, something happened that made Director Veleth drop the datapad she had been reviewing and stare at her monitors with all of her compound eyes wide with disbelief. Terminus, the largest and most dangerous of the three alpha beasts, the creature that had killed more caretakers than the other two combined, slowly rose from his position at the far end of the enclosure and began walking toward Sam. Every observer still present pressed against the glass, certain they were about to witness the moment when human optimism finally met reality in the most brutal way possible. But Terminus did not attack, and he did not bare his teeth or raise his claws or emit the psychic pressure that had destroyed so many minds before. Instead, the massive creature walked up to where Sam sat reading his book, lowered his enormous body to the ground, and lay down beside the human like a dog settling next to its master after a long day. Nova followed moments later, taking a position on Sam's other side and resting her great head on her front claws with a sigh that seemed to release tension she had been holding for years. Echo was the last to approach, the youngest beast moving with careful steps, could curl up at Sam's feet and close her eyes in what could only be described as contentment. Sam never stopped reading, never acknowledged the enormous creatures surrounding him, as if this was the most normal thing in the world, just kept turning pages and speaking words in that calm and steady voice. Director Veleth sat in her observation chair for a very long time, trying to process what she had just witnessed, because the alpha beasts had never shown passive behavior toward any living creature, had never chosen proximity without violence, had never treated another being as anything other than prey or threat. Yet there they were, curled around a small and fragile human, like he was something precious that needed protecting. And for the first time in 100 years, the most dangerous creatures in known space looked something very close to peaceful. 3 months had passed since Sam Porter first walked into the Alpha Beast enclosure with nothing but a worn paperback book and a patience that seemed to have no limits. And in that time, the scientific community across the galaxy had descended into complete and utter chaos. The impossible had become ordinary inside the preserve walls, and every day brought new evidence that everything the galaxy thought it knew about these terrifying creatures was wrong. Terminus, Nova, and Echo had transformed from mindless killing machines into something that resembled loyal companions, following Sam around their enclosure with an almost puppyish devotion that made hardened scientists question their own sanity. They responded to his voice commands without hesitation, coming when he called their names and stopping whatever they were doing when he spoke certain words in certain tones. They allowed him to touch them, to run his hands over their armored hides and examine their claws, and even treat minor wounds without any resistance whatsoever. Dr. Yenna Moss was the station's xenobiologist, a woman who had dedicated her entire career to understanding alien life forms, and who had studied the alpha beasts from a safe distance for 15 years, without ever learning anything truly useful. She conducted study after study on Sam and his methods, searching desperately for some explanation that would make sense to the scientific community that was demanding answers. She tested for chemical agents that might be affecting the beast's behavior, for pheromones that humans might naturally produce, for hidden technology that could be manipulating their minds. She found nothing, absolutely nothing, that could explain why these creatures had suddenly decided that one particular human was worthy of their trust and protection. Sam was simply doing what he had always done with animals back on Earth, treating them as individuals with their own needs and fears and personalities, rather than as specimens to be studied or threats to be neutralized. "They are not monsters," he told Dr. Moss one afternoon, while she watched him scratch behind Nova's armored earplates, producing a sound from the massive beast that was disturbingly similar to a purr. "They are just scared and lonely, and tired of being treated like things instead of beings." Dr. Moss wrote down his words in her research notes, and wondered if anyone in the galactic community would believe such a simple explanation for such an extraordinary phenomenon. News of Sam's success spread quickly through the communication networks that connected 1,000 worlds, and soon the preserve began receiving visitors from every corner of known space. High Chancellor Drevon of the Hegemony, one of the most powerful political figures in the galaxy, traveled 14 star systems just to witness the impossible with his own eyes. He stood behind the reinforced glass and watched as Sam sat among the deadliest predators in existence, reading from his book while Terminus dozed beside him, and Echo played with a large stone she had found somewhere in the enclosure. "How do you do it?" the Chancellor asked through the communication system that allowed visitors to speak with people inside the enclosure, his voice carrying a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Sam looked up from his book and shrugged his shoulders in that casual way humans often did when they did not think they were doing anything special. "I do not do anything remarkable," he said, in a voice that held no pride or arrogance. "I just pay attention to what they are telling me and respond to what they need, because every creature communicates, if you are willing to listen." The Chancellor shook his head slowly, his ceremonial robes rustling with the movement. "We have empaths in the hegemony who are far more powerful than any human could ever be," he said. "Read thoughts and feelings as easily as you read that book in your hands," and they fled screaming from the psychic pressure these beasts emit. Sam nodded as if this made perfect sense to him. "Maybe that is the problem," he replied. "Maybe you are listening too hard and trying too much, because sometimes you just need to be quiet and let someone come to you in their own time." The words seemed simple, almost foolishly simple, but the Chancellor found himself thinking about them for days afterward as he traveled back to his homeworld. Meanwhile, something was changing in Echo, the youngest and most curious of the 3 alpha beasts. She had begun bringing Sam objects from around the enclosure, carrying them carefully in her massive jaws, and depositing them at his feet, like gifts from a friend who did not quite know how to express affection in any other way. There were stones of various colors and sizes, shed scales from her own armored hide that glittered in the artificial light, fragments of things long buried in the enclosure's soil that no one had known existed. Sam accepted each gift with the same solemnity and respect, thanking Echo in a soft voice and placing each item carefully in a small box he kept near his reading chair. Dr. Moss collected samples of these gifts and analyzed them in her laboratory, spending long nights running tests and comparing results to every database she could access. What she discovered made her sit down heavily in her chair and stare at her screens for a very long time. Each object had deep emotional significance in what could only be described as alpha beast culture, a culture that no one had known existed, because no one had ever survived long enough to observe it. The stones were markers of territory and family, passed down through generations as symbols of belonging and connection. The shed scales were offerings of trust, given only to those considered safe, enough to be near during moments of vulnerability. The buried fragments were artifacts of memory, objects that held meaning from times long past, that Echo was somehow sharing with this strange human who had earned her affection. Echo was not just giving Sam pretty things she had found lying around. She was showing him her treasures, teaching him about her people, inviting him into a world that had been hidden from the galaxy for longer than anyone could remember. Sam seemed to understand this instinctively, treating each gift with the reverence it deserved, and slowly building a vocabulary of gestures and sounds that allowed him to communicate with the beasts in ways that went far beyond simple commands. He learned that a certain tilt of the head meant curiosity, while a different angle meant concern. He discovered that a low rumbling sound from Terminus indicated contentment, while a higher pitch suggested alertness. He found that Nova would press her snout against his hand when she wanted attention, and would turn away when she needed time alone. These were not the behaviors of mindless predators, driven by nothing but hunger and aggression. These were the actions of intelligent beings with complex emotional lives that the galaxy had never bothered to try understanding. Dr. Moss compiled her findings into a report that she sent to every major scientific institution in known space, a document that would change how many species thought about the alpha beasts forever. But the most important discovery was not in her report, because it was something that could not be measured or quantified or explained in scientific terms. The most important discovery was that Sam Porter, a simple human from a small planet that most of the galaxy still considered primitive, had found a way to connect with creatures that had rejected every other form of contact for 100 years. And he had done it not through strength or technology or psychic power, but through something far more rare and valuable. He had done it through patience and kindness and a genuine desire to understand. The attack came without any warning during the station's night cycle, when the corridors were empty and the security staff was operating with minimal crew, and the darkness provided perfect cover for those who meant to do terrible things. A faction of the Syndicate had spent months planning this operation, gathering intelligence and bribing officials, and preparing equipment that could disable even the most advanced security systems in the galaxy. The Syndicate was an interstellar criminal organization that dealt in exotic animals and rare biological materials, and they had been watching the alpha beasts for years with hungry eyes and greedy hearts. The hides of these creatures were worth more than some planetary economies, armor that could stop any weapon and regenerate from almost any damage. Their psychic glands were believed to grant enhanced mental abilities when properly processed, a claim that had never been proven, but that wealthy collectors were willing to pay dearly for. To pay fortunes to test. 3 alpha beasts meant wealth beyond imagination for anyone bold enough to capture them, and the Syndicate had finally decided that the time was right to make their move. 30 armed mercenaries moved through the station corridors with military precision, each one wearing advanced combat armor and carrying weapons designed to take down the largest prey in known space. They disabled security systems with electronic warfare tools that cost more than most ships, cutting through firewalls and sensor networks like they were made of nothing at all. They flooded the preserve's ventilation system with a paralytic gas designed specifically for large predators, a chemical compound that should have left the alpha beasts helpless and easy to transport. Their leader was a scarred man named Cole, who had made his fortune capturing creatures that everyone else said could not be captured, and he watched the operation unfold with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before. What none of them had accounted for was Sam Porter. He had been sleeping in a small room adjoining the enclosure, a habit he had developed after Nova showed signs of anxiety during the dark hours when she could not see her human friend. When the gas began seeping under his door, filling the air with a faint chemical smell that his trained senses recognized immediately as wrong, he grabbed the emergency rebreather he kept by his bed and moved into the enclosure proper. The door sealed behind him with a hiss that seemed very final, locking him inside with 3 massive predators, while unknown attackers approached from outside. The alpha beasts were already awake, their superior senses having detected the threat long before any alarm could sound. Terminus stood at the front of the enclosure with his massive body positioned to block any approach to his family, his armored hide seeming to absorb the dim emergency lighting, and his eyes glowing with an inner fire that promised violence to anyone foolish enough to come closer. His psychic aura blazed outward like a silent alarm, that terrible pressure that had driven empaths to madness and warriors to flee in terror. But Sam felt only warmth from that psychic presence, only protection and concern, and a fierce determination to keep him safe. He placed his hand on Terminus's flank and felt the vibration of barely contained power running through that enormous body. "Easy, big guy," he said in the same calm voice he always used. "We are going to be okay, I promise." Nova positioned herself to the left, with her claws extended and her teeth bared, ready to strike at anything that threatened her family. Echo crouched low to Sam's right, her younger instincts telling her to protect the human who had shown her such kindness, even if it meant facing whatever was coming through that door. The mercenaries reached the enclosure's outer barrier and began cutting through with plasma torches that burned hot enough to melt the reinforced material in seconds. Cole watched the progress with greedy anticipation, already calculating how much money each beast would bring on the black market. The paralytic gas should have left them helpless and docile, easy targets for the capture equipment his team had brought. When the barrier finally fell and his mercenaries poured through the opening with weapons raised, they found something very different from what they had expected. 3 alpha beasts stood fully awake and clearly angry, their massive forms filling the space with a presence that made even the bravest mercenaries hesitate. And in front of them stood a single human with no weapon and no armor, just a rebreather mask and a calm expression that suggested he knew something they did not. "Leave now," Sam said, in a voice that carried no fear whatsoever, "and you might survive." "What comes next?" Cole laughed at the absurdity of the threat. This small, soft creature standing before 30 armed professionals and telling them to run away. "1 soft human and 3 drugged animals," he said with a grin that showed too many teeth. "This'll be easier than I thought." He raised his weapon and pointed it at Sam's chest, his finger already moving toward the trigger. He never got the chance to fire. What happened next was recorded by the helmet cameras that every mercenary wore, footage that would later be studied by military academies across the galaxy as an example of what happens when you underestimate your enemy. Terminus moved faster than anything his size should have been able to move, crossing the distance between himself and the mercenaries in a blur of armored muscle and razor claws. The psychic blast he released was not the unfocused pressure that had overwhelmed empaths in the past, but a targeted strike that dropped 12 mercenaries instantly, their minds shutting down like lights being switched off. Nova flanked left with a speed that defied physics, her claws slicing through combat armor like it was made of thin fabric, and her teeth finding flesh wherever she struck. Echo flanked right with the enthusiasm of youth, perhaps less precise than her elders, but no less deadly, her smaller size allowing her to move between enemies with devastating efficiency. The battle lasted 90 seconds, and when it was over, every intruder was either dead or unconscious on the enclosure floor. Cole himself lay at Terminus's feet, with his weapon shattered and his armor torn, and his eyes wide with the terror of someone who had finally met something he could not defeat. But the most remarkable thing about that footage was not the violence or the speed or the devastating power of the alpha beasts in combat. The most remarkable thing was Sam. Throughout the entire fight, creatures had moved around him with surgical precision, never once endangering him for even a fraction of a second. At one point, Nova had actually lifted him with her snout and physically moved him behind her massive body when a stray shot came too close to where he stood. They were not just fighting to protect themselves or their territory. They were fighting to protect him, this small, fragile human who had shown them kindness in a galaxy that had only ever shown them cruelty. When the station's security forces finally arrived and found the aftermath of the battle, they stood in stunned silence at the sight before them. 30 of the most dangerous mercenaries in known space had been defeated by 3 creatures that everyone had assumed were mindless killing machines. And in the center of the carnage stood Sam Porter, completely unharmed, with his hand resting on Terminus's blood-stained hide, and his voice soft as he whispered words of comfort to beasts. That had just proven they would destroy anything that threatened him. Good job, he said quietly. You kept us safe, just like I knew you would. Terminus made a low rumbling sound that might have been acknowledgement, and for just a moment, his terrible eyes seemed almost gentle as he looked down at the human who had somehow become the most important being in his world. The news of what had happened spread across the galaxy within hours, and suddenly everyone wanted to know how a single human had commanded such loyalty from creatures that had killed everything else they had ever encountered. The answer was simple, though most species would struggle to understand it for years to come. Sam had not commanded anything. He had simply cared, and the alpha beasts had recognized that caring for what it was, something real and genuine in a universe full of beings who only saw them as resources to be exploited. And they had decided, all on their own, that this human was worth protecting no matter what the cost. The aftermath of the Syndicate attack brought attention that Sam had never wanted and would have happily avoided if anyone had given him the choice. News of the failed raid spread through galactic communication networks faster than starships could travel, and with it came an endless flood of questions that no one seemed able to answer. How had a single human survived where 17 different species had failed so completely? How had mindless predators become loyal protectors, willing to kill for someone they should have seen as nothing more than prey? How had the alpha beasts, creatures known across the galaxy for their unstoppable violence, learned to fight with such precision that they could wage war around a fragile human without causing him the slightest harm? The Galactic Science Council demanded a full investigation, sending their most respected researcher to Nexus Station 7 with orders to find answers that would satisfy the countless beings who were asking these questions. Elder Keth was ancient, even by the standards of his long-lived species, a being who had studied alpha beasts for 300 years from the safety of observation posts and orbital stations. He had watched dozens of caretakers enter those enclosures with hope in their hearts, and he had watched the same number of broken bodies being carried out in whatever containers could hold what was left of them. he had developed theories about the beasts that had been accepted as fact throughout the scientific community. Theories that painted them as evolutionary dead ends, predators so perfectly adapted for killing that they had lost the ability to do anything else. Now, those theories were crumbling, and Elder Keth had come to understand why. What made his investigation different from all the others was the relationship Sam had built with the alpha beasts over the past months. For the first time in recorded history, a researcher could actually approach these creatures without being immediately torn apart. Elder Keth worked carefully and respectfully, always asking Sam for permission before attempting any new type of study, and always backing away when the beasts showed signs of discomfort. He conducted deep scans of their neurological activity, using equipment so sensitive it could detect the electrical impulses of individual neurons. He analyzed their psychic emissions, with tools designed to map the invisible energies that flowed between minds. He recorded their behaviors and vocalizations and gestures, building a database of information that no scientist had ever been able to gather before. What he discovered over those long weeks of careful study changed everything the galaxy thought it knew about the alpha beasts. These creatures were not mindless predators at all, not evolutionary dead ends or biological killing machines. They were the remnants of a fallen civilization, beings whose ancestors had built starships that sailed between the stars and written poetry that made listeners weep with its beauty, and constructed cities that touched the clouds. 10,000 years ago, a catastrophic plague had swept through their population, destroying not their bodies, but their minds, stripping away the higher functions that had made them one of the most advanced species the galaxy had ever known. The survivors had devolved into what the galaxy now saw, creatures driven by instinct and fear, unable to communicate the complex thoughts that still flickered somewhere deep in their damaged consciousness. Their aggression toward other species was not mindless violence or predatory hunger. It was fear, pure and simple and devastating. Every race that had approached them over the centuries had come with psychic signatures that the beasts could read as easily as Sam read his paperback books. The Vorixians had projected conquest and domination, seeing the beasts as challenges to overcome and trophies to display. The Krellans had projected clinical detachment and scientific curiosity, viewing the beasts as specimens to dissect and study. The Mendari empaths had projected overwhelming interests that felt like invasion, their powerful minds pressing against the beast's consciousness, like hands trying to pry open a locked door. Every species projected their intentions, whether they knew it or not, and every species had intended to use the alpha beasts for something, to exploit their strength, or harvest their organs, or study their biology. But humans were different in a way that Elder Keck struggled to explain to the council that had sent him. Human psychic projections were quiet, almost invisible compared to the loud broadcasts of older and more evolved species. Their minds did not shout their intentions into the universe the way other beings did. And Sam specifically projected something that the last beasts born, alpha beasts, had not felt in 10,000 years of fear and violence and loneliness. He projected genuine care with no ulterior motive whatsoever. He did not want to study them, or harvest them, or display them, or use them for anything at all. He wanted only to make sure they were healthy and comfortable and happy, to give them good lives because they deserved good lives. His patience, his willingness to wait for them to come to him rather than forcing contact, his acceptance of Echo's gifts as precious treasures rather than valuable specimens. These things spoke a language that the beasts had. Anyone in the universe could still speak. He reminds them of their own caretakers, Elder Keth explained to the stunned council members who had gathered to hear his findings, his ancient voice heavy with the weight of what he had learned. Before the plague, before the fall, the Alpha Beast civilization had members who specialized in compassion and healing. beings whose purpose was to care for those who were hurting and to mend wounds that could not be seen. Humans appear to have a similar capacity, perhaps even a stronger one, because it is not formalized or trained or calculated. It is simply who they are, woven into their nature so deeply that they do not even realize how rare and precious it makes them. The council members exchanged uncomfortable glances across the great chamber where they had gathered. They had spent 50 years treating humanity as the galaxy's newest children, a primitive species barely worth acknowledging in the grand affairs of interstellar politics. They had patted humans on the head and told them to be patient while the grown-up species handled the important matters. They had assumed that because humans lacked psychic powers and advanced technology and ancient wisdom, they had nothing valuable to offer the galactic community. Now they were learning that humans possessed something incredibly rare, something that most species had lost long ago in their climb toward power and advancement: weakness. Elder Keth looked at her with eyes that had seen 3 centuries of galactic history. "We learn from it," he said simply. "We accept that a species we dismissed as primitive has something to teach us, and we humble ourselves enough to listen." The chamber was very quiet after that, filled with beings who were not accustomed to being told they had something to learn from anyone, let alone from the soft and fragile humans they had always looked down upon. But the evidence was undeniable, recorded in data and footage, and the testimony of everyone who had witnessed what Sam Porter had accomplished. Somehow, impossibly, a human had succeeded where the entire galaxy had failed, and he had done it by being exactly what the Alpha Beasts needed someone to be. Word of Sam Porter's success with the Alpha Beasts spread to every corner of known space, carried by news broadcasts and scientific journals, and the endless gossip networks that connected 1,000 different worlds. Within a single year, everything changed for humanity's place in the galactic community. Wildlife facilities across the galaxy began requesting human caretakers for their most difficult and dangerous charges, species that had resisted all contact and killed everyone who tried to approach them. And one by one, those humans succeeded where others had failed, building relationships with creatures that the galaxy had written off as impossible to reach. A young woman named Katie Bell traveled to the frozen moons of the Outer Rim to work with the Ice Stalkers, predators that had eaten every researcher sent to study them, and within 6 months they were following her across the tundra like loyal hounds. Position at a sanctuary for void swimmers, beings of pure energy that had burned out the minds of every telepath who tried to communicate with them, and he learned to sit with them in silence until they chose to share their thoughts with him. A teenager named Danny Cruz became the first person to successfully approach a nest of swarm queens, insectoid creatures that had destroyed entire colonies when threatened, and he did it by bringing them small gifts of food and waiting patiently until they accepted his presence. Each success added to humanity's growing reputation as something special, something different from all the other species that had reached for the stars. They were not the strongest, or the smartest, or the most advanced beings in the galaxy, but they had something that seemed to be uniquely their own, a capacity for connection that transcended language and biology, and the vast distances between different forms of life. Back on Nexus Station 7, Sam had no interest in the fame that his work had brought him. He stayed in his small quarters adjoining the enclosure, content to spend his days with Terminus and Nova and Echo, reading to them and learning their ancient language and helping Dr. Moss document a culture that had been hidden from the universe for 10,000 years. He had become fluent in the gestures and sounds that the Alpha Beasts used to communicate, and through Echo's patient teaching he had learned things about their fallen civilization that no one else in the galaxy would ever know. He knew the names they had given themselves before the plague, names that translated roughly to those who remember the light. He knew the stories they told about their ancestors, tales of great cities and beautiful art, and a people who had believed that compassion was the highest virtue any being could possess. He knew the grief they carried for everything they had lost, and he knew the hope that had slowly begun to return, begun to grow in their hearts as they realized that someone in the universe still remembered how to care. On the anniversary of his first day in the enclosure, a delegation of the galaxy's most powerful leaders arrived at the station to formally thank him for everything he had accomplished. High Chancellor Drevon presented him with the Star of Unity, the highest civilian honor in the entire hegemony, a medal that had only been awarded 17 times in galactic history. Fleet Admiral Zinn of the Coalition offered him a position as diplomatic liaison between humanity and the rest of the galaxy, a job that came with a salary larger than most planets' annual budgets, and influence that would make him one of the most powerful humans in existence. Sam listened politely to each offer, while Terminus dozed behind him, and Nova playfully tried to steal his book, and Echo arranged her collection of treasures in a pattern that only she understood. When they were finished speaking, he smiled and shook his head. "I am not special," he told them, standing in the enclosure he had come to think of as home. "Any human could have done what I did if they had been given the chance. We have been caring for other species since before we had fire or language or any of the things that are supposed to make a civilization advanced. We raised wolves into dogs and wild cats into companions, and kept animals in our homes because we enjoyed their company, not because we wanted anything from them. It is just what we do, what we have always done, what we will probably always do." High Chancellor Drevon leaned forward with genuine curiosity in his ancient eyes. "But why?" he asked. "What evolutionary advantage could such behavior possibly provide to your species? Why would you spend resources caring for creatures that cannot help you survive or reproduce or advance your civilization?" Sam looked at the Chancellor for a long moment, then looked back at the three massive beings who had become his family. "Who said it had to provide an advantage?" he replied in a soft voice. "Sometimes you take care of someone just because they need it, because they are hurting and you can help, and that is all the reason anyone should ever need." The Chancellor had no response to that simple truth, and neither did anyone else in the delegation. They stood in silence as the weight of those words settled over them, realizing that they had just been taught something important by a species they had spent decades dismissing as primitive and unworthy of respect. As the delegation departed to return to their ships and their important responsibilities, Echo approached Sam and placed something in his hand. It was a small crystal that glowed with an inner light, warm against his palm and pulsing with a gentle rhythm that matched his heartbeat. He recognized it immediately from Echo's teachings. Bonding stone, the most sacred object in Alpha Beast culture, given only to those considered true family by blood or by choice. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, and Echo pressed her massive head against his chest in response. A gesture of affection that would have been terrifying from any other creature, but felt like coming home. Across the galaxy, other humans were making their own discoveries about what made their species truly special. It was not their technology, which was still primitive compared to civilizations that had been spacefaring for millennia. It was not their military power, which was laughable next to the great fleets of the major empires. It was not their intelligence or their strength, or any of the qualities that other species had always used to measure worth and importance. It was something much simpler and much more profound. It was the capacity to look at a terrifying monster and see past the claws and the teeth, and the danger to ask a question that most beings in the universe had forgotten how to ask. Are you lonely? Do you need a friend? Can I help? And somehow, impossibly, wonderfully, the monsters kept saying yes. in research stations and wildlife preserves and sanctuaries across 1,000 worlds. Humans sat with creatures that had killed everything else, offering patience and kindness and a genuine desire to understand. They asked for nothing in return, expected nothing, demanded nothing. They simply cared, and in caring, they changed the galaxy forever. The Alpha Beasts were only the beginning, the first of many species that would learn what the humans had always known, that compassion was not weakness, and kindness was not foolishness, and the greatest strength any being could possess was the courage to love something that everyone else had given up on. Sam Porter never left Nexus Station 7, never accepted the honors, or the positions or the fame that the galaxy tried to give him. He stayed with Terminus and Nova and Echo until the end of his days, reading them stories and learning their history and showing them every single day that they were worthy of being loved. And when he finally passed away, old and content and surrounded by the family he had chosen, the 3 Alpha Beasts mourned him in the way of their ancient people. They sang songs of remembrance that had not been heard in 10,000 years, their voices echoing through the station and out into the void of space. They told stories of his kindness to each other, keeping his memory alive the way their ancestors had once kept the memories of their greatest heroes. And they waited, patient and hopeful, for the next human who would come to care for them. Because now they knew something wonderful and precious, something that the plague had made them forget, and that Sam had helped them remember, that they were not alone in the universe. They knew that somewhere out there, in that vast and often cruel galaxy, there were beings who would look at them and see not monsters to be feared or resources to be exploited, but friends to be made and family to be found, and lonely souls worthy of compassion. And that knowledge, more than anything else, was the greatest gift that humanity had given to the stars.